From FingerLakes1.com and presented by FL1 Radio, I'm Josh Durso, and this is Inside the FLX. Last week, State Senator Tom O'Mara was on the program discussing his platform and several key issues in the 58th District, and now we're joined by Amanda Kirchgessner, the Democratic challenger who will appear on the ballot against O'Mara in less than a week. We're going to cover a lot of ground in our conversation, talking platform, local issues, jobs, healthcare, and even higher education, with the goal being to help voters get informed ahead of Election Day. All of that and much more on the other side of our only break this hour coming up. Stay tuned.
I was severely injured. I was on a ventilator. My husband was scared, and he just went for the nearest number that he had heard advertised over and over and figured they're the best. They know what they're doing. I think that's the typical reaction. But unfortunately, it wasn't the right one. And I'm thankful that we learned that early on in the process. He decided to look for someone locally who would give us a little more personalized attention. And when we met Steve and talked with him, we knew that we had found that person. If you want to feel like you have an attorney who's in your corner, who's going to listen to you, who's going to endeavor to understand you, give Steve a call. I really felt like everyone at Madej, Mears, and Rickey really cared.
For a law firm that cares about you, contact Madej, Mears, and Rickey at 315-568-0911. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome.
All right, Amanda, thanks so much for coming up and making time for us. A ton to talk about. Obviously, a really interesting race, a really interesting time to be running for office. So I guess the first logical question to ask you is, why on earth did you choose now to run?
Well, thank you for having me. Nobody else wanted to run this race, Josh, and I thought it was so important that the voters have a choice, and I thought it was so important that the people of the 58th District have a choice in November. And that's where we are. You know, somebody who's been serving people for a very long time. I recognize there's a huge gap in our government right now. The middle class is disappearing before our eyes. It's going extinct. And as someone who's worked for a living, serving all kinds of working people, my heart breaks. You know, people are working harder and harder than ever before for less and less, and the cost of living here is increasing rapidly. My friends have been leaving this state for years, you know.
All of our friends.
All of our friends, yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's not easy to make the ends meet.
So I guess that with as divisive as our political culture is right now, how do you cut through the noise and try to just sort of bring some clarity and bring that realistic message? Because it sounds like that's what you're trying to do.
Well, I think it's all about meeting people where they are. And I recognize that there's good ideas, you know, from every political walk of life. Mm-hmm. There's a lot to be learned from someone who's homeless. There's a lot to be learned from someone who's, you know, worked in a steelworkers union for 35 years and, you know, sent their kids to college. There's a lot to be learned from students who are graduating from college and can't afford to pay their student loans and end up waiting tables. So it's just recognizing everybody's experience is valuable. Listening to people who think differently, listening to people who want to challenge your ideas. You know, I have a very open mind for those kinds of conversations. Like, I learned that in the diner. You know, there's a wealth of information to be learned from just about anybody if you're open to it, and I'm open to it.
Now, I would have to imagine that you have some pretty strong feelings as far as the unopposed races, which in this particular cycle, we're going through the counties in the region, in the Finger Lakes, and in the southern tier, and it's something like 70 to 75% of the races are uncontested, whether that's, you know, town clerk or, you know, town council, all the way up to assembly races and state senate races. Does that really, really bother you? Is that really the reason why you got involved?
Well, I think for a lot of people, it's like learning how to get involved, especially if you're a political outsider. Yeah. If you don't belong to the Republican or Democratic committee, it's very hard to learn how to cut a path into, you know, even just appearing on the ballot for a primary. What I think is really exciting was like the number of primary races in Chemung County. They had Republican primaries, they had Democratic primaries. Lots of people running for office. It just shows me that more people are willing to jump in and get their hands, quote unquote, dirty. Mm-hmm. You know, I think that that's really important. And for me, this was really a learning experience. I kind of got on the Democratic committee in Tompkins County on a dare. I helped my friend run for office for county legislature last year, and we had 2 days left to get up, petition to get on the committee. I went out and did it in the rain, and I learned a lot. And it was actually someone on the Democratic committee who suggested I run for this office after many of my diner regulars had suggested I run for some office because nobody was looking at this race. So,
I have to ask, because I always think that after you do it, after you're in there and you actually, in your case, you got on the committee and you figured out what your path was to getting here. Looking back, was it easier than what you thought it would have been?
I mean, honestly, my favorite part of this was petitioning to get on the ballot for the primary. I wish it were easier for third-party candidates or independent candidates to get on the ballot. I mean, I guess if you're green or working families or conservative, it's much easier. You don't need as many signatures. You just have to locate the party members and get them to sign to let you run. But if somebody wanted to run as a truly third-party independent candidate, you'd need 3,000 signatures. Whereas if you're running for a Democratic or Republican seat as a Democrat or Republican, you only need 1,000. And so it was much easier than I thought. Our goal was to get 2,000 signatures. We got almost 2,400, which I'm really proud of my team for helping me pull off. We did have a little bit of committee support, but I mean, if we'd relied only on the committees, we wouldn't have gotten enough signatures to do it. So, I mean, I guess it's been really valuable for me because anybody who wanted to run for office, I could, tell them how to do it. It's not as difficult to get on the ballot as you might think. The hardest part is balancing your personal life, and, I had to leave my job after March of this year in order to do this full time. For a local office, it might be a little bit easier to maintain employment, but, it's really tricky for people who want to get involved, especially if you are on a budget. I mean, you have to keep working to make those ends meet. I did this how most Americans did, on debt.
So I have to ask them, because you brought up the employment point, which I think is interesting, because we see a lot of state office holders with sometimes full-time jobs outside of their elected office. Is that, as somebody who's now gone through at least part of the process, does that sort of raise new thoughts about, what needs to change on that front so that there is a little cleaner operation in Albany?
I mean, so much needs to change. Right now it's an old boys club. I think we all know that saying that 3 men in a smoke-filled room essentially decide what's going to happen in Albany. And I don't think that's too far off the mark. It's dark money with deep pockets that owns our government here in New York State, and that's a big problem. So we need campaign finance reform. I think outside income is really there's too many opportunities for it to have the appearance of impropriety, especially if someone's an attorney and there might be a conflict of interest between, a firm or people they represent. And
that was the case specifically with your opponent, actually. If we're going to be calling a spade a spade.
Well, and that wasn't even meant to direct it so much at Tom O'Mara. I think it's really important, for people to think about who actually represents us in our state houses, in the federal government. I mean, lawyers are way overrepresented. Working people, way underrepresented. And I think we need a few more farmers up in Albany, maybe a few bus drivers, a dishwasher or two, people who've actually worked and, been on the ground, so to speak. White collar employees, white collar people are saturated. Very well represented, and the people who actually do the work have very little voice and very little say.
So I guess my first real question here is, what are sort of some of the top 2 or 3 issues that you're hearing about when you're talking to people, when you're actually going door to door, like you said, collecting signatures? What were some of the things that really stood out to you?
In healthcare, you could tie that to the opioid epidemic and the meth epidemic. I mean, drug abuse is huge in this district. You know, you'd knock on the door and get signatures, and some people would be pointing out the 5 or 6 drug houses that they could see from their front porch. And, you know, and they'll talk about somebody getting shot down the block, and it's just, you know, we have to realize, like, there's a human cost. Like, these are people's children, these are people's parents who are trapped in this, and, you know, we need more beds for people who want to enter rehab, and we also have to make it much quicker. So when somebody's ready to go, they need to be able to enter that system quickly. And I don't think one size fits all. You know, different treatments work for different folks, but some of the more effective programs have been 90-day stints in rehab facilities with long-term halfway house situations, which allow people to get back on their feet, save money, you know, so they don't become caught back in that cycle. But you need to break that cycle, and only time and community support are really going to fill that gap. Healthcare, obviously, I know this is one place where I really diverge from Tom O'Mara, as I'm a big supporter of the New York Health Act. Several outside studies have shown not only would it reduce our costs for healthcare in New York State, we would create tens of thousands of jobs while we're at it. And I think that this would be what we'd need, you know, what would need to happen in New York State to essentially open the floodgates for new employers to come here. Not to mention it would lift the unfunded mandate of Medicaid off of our counties and some of our cash poor counties, which there are several in the 58th and across upstate New York. I mean, we would unleash, I believe, 70% of Chemung County's budget if we lifted Medicaid from their burden. That's a lot of money. It's 40% in Steuben County, you know, between 20 and 30 between Tompkins, Schuyler, and Yates. That's a substantial savings at the local level. It could result in a huge property tax savings, and I mean, they'd have money that they could spend on the necessary infrastructure repairs that absolutely have to happen. I think climate change is also another huge issue throughout this region. Flooding is becoming increasingly prevalent, and I think we just need to work on preparing for climate change. And I mean, I don't think it is a threat, or, you know, it's never a bad thing to be prepared.
Right.
So I'd love to see us investing more in greenhouse technology, you know, in terms of manufacturing, maybe more food processing, building up large local stores of food. I think that these are entry-level jobs that anybody could take. I think you know, when you're doing something like providing wholesome food for your neighbors, I think that's a very fulfilling job. And, you know, it relies on the best things about this area, you know, agricultural production, I mean, honest days work. And I think to tie that back into flooding, you know, we need to like reinvest in our infrastructure and update our water management facilities, especially as, you know, our smaller towns seem to be growing. And I just think it's a huge opportunity for us to invest in the future.
Is New York State as a whole, from your perspective, kind of just behind by maybe 20 or 30 years?
Absolutely. I mean, most of the latest scientific evidence shows we have 12 years to get off of fossil fuels and reduce our carbon emissions. 12.
Now, and I've heard the same thing, and I'm not arguing at all.
Yeah.
But I'm serious. I have seriously questioned the ability of the U.S. as a whole. Forget about just New York State or just, you know, the 58th district or whatever district you're in. That is a very big ask.
It is a huge ask, but if people focus on what we could do at the local level, I think we could actually stand a chance, especially here where if you look at climate change projection maps, like the southern tier in the Finger Lakes region will become one of the most desirable places to live on the planet. And that's simply put, which means we have to be focused on preserving our freshwater resources for future generations, preserving our ag land to make sure that we can continue to produce the amount of food that it's going to need to produce, and building for more people. I mean, but this all means jobs. Yeah. I mean, this means tens of thousands of jobs. And, you know.
Since since we're on the whole topic of the environment, I think it would be fair to ask you about the incinerator in Romulus that has obviously gotten a ton of regional attention.
Sure.
Your thoughts on a proposal like that, which on the surface, if folks aren't looking too closely, may seem like the environmentally friendly thing to do?
Burning our trash isn't environmentally friendly. I mean, I think it's a foolhardy proposal. I think often people with lots of money get what they want, and I love to see communities organizing at the grassroots level to resist large corporations from getting their way. Mm-hmm. And the whole purpose of government was, in my opinion, is to protect people from the overreach of corporations, mm-hmm. right? And I feel that there are better uses for the Finger Lakes. I mean, this region is so dependent upon agricultural production. You look at our wine industry, our beer industry, we grow tons of grain here and tons of food. I don't think it's worth the risk. Just look at Waterloo. You know, when I was a child, there wasn't a trash mountain, and now there's 3 or 4. They're huge, and they smell awful. And most of that trash was not generated here. So, you know, the Finger Lakes is New York City's trash heap. Like, that, it just doesn't compute in my brain. And I think we're supposed to be creative and ingenuity and have a little bit of ingenuity about us. So, like, why don't we come up with better materials, ones that actually biodegrade?
Well, and there has been a lot of, or seems to be a lot of attention now around ideas like no more straws or get rid of single use. Obviously, that feels very surface level as far as attempts goes to clean things up. But is that the kind of incremental process that we should expect, the baby steps, so to speak?
I mean, I think we need to have policy and then incentives. I think, I know like single-use plastic straws are really, certain people with disabilities need them. Mm-hmm. So, you don't want to punish people for using something that makes their life easier. Mm-hmm. I think these things need to be weighed with, just a well-measured perspective.
Common sense?
Common sense, yeah, absolutely. But, single-use plastic bags, like, there's a lot that we could do in just helping people, move to reusable items. Mm-hmm. And I don't think people would be too resistant to that, especially if we incentivized it.
So the next logical topic for us to sort of talk about, you've talked about the jobs, creating more jobs, you've talked about the economy, you've talked about healthcare, you talked a little bit about the opioid crisis, mm-hmm. although I do want to talk more about that later. Mm-hmm. Retaining young people. Yeah. That is that's the buzz phrase, it seems, over the last couple of years for New York State. Governor Cuomo has said that, all of us collectively are leaving because of the weather.
That's not true.
Maybe there's as somebody who hates winter, maybe there's a small bit of truth to that, but that is not the reason for upstate's economic woes, clearly. What do you think, in your estimation, needs to be done or can be done to help keep some of those young people here? Or what are the steps that need to be taken immediately?
We need to build more housing. I think affordability is a big part of why people are leaving.
The gap.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I've talked to people across the 58th, Hector, Wayland, people who can't buy a home in the towns they grew up in. And that, to me, is ridiculous. I mean, people who work for a living can't afford to buy a home where they grew up. Most of the people I've spoken to, working in restaurants, like, they live with their parents. Mm-hmm. Not the worst thing ever, but when you look at American and rugged...
Not ideal.
Not for most people. Yeah. And it's... I just think that we need to build more housing. We need to increase the housing supply everywhere. I think we need to focus on helping our urban areas densify mm-hmm. a bit. But also, I think well-planned rural development... because not everybody wants to live in the city. And a lot of people like kind of raise their noses at trailer parks, but I mean, that's a great way for people to live densely in rural settings. It's not a bad thing. And I think with the tiny home movement, I mean, there's plenty of opportunities, you know, for some people to decide to do some planned development in the countryside. But we need to build more housing. That's all about jobs, though.
And what about the rental side of it, too? Because there does seem to be a gap that's getting created where the median rental price is climbing. And there, again, you have a stock problem where there just aren't enough, it seems, to go around. But
sure.
At the same time, there is a clear cost problem.
Well, I mean, it depends on the market that you're looking at. I want to look into vacancy taxes because I recognize often there are people, you know, landlords who have vacant housing that they're not renting as a means of writing it off on their income taxes. And I think that if we can figure out clever ways to tax vacant apartments, that could be helpful. I think, you know, rent control, certainly in New York City. I think a lot of people are being displaced from New York City into upstate because of the inaffordability. I think in denser areas, looking at rent controls. But I also feel like passing the New York Health Act, cutting the Medicaid portion of county tax bills could help cut property taxes, which could then be passed off as a savings on rent. I mean, it isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, but I think that we need to be looking at the problems more broadly. You know?
Well, and to your point, you're talking about what you're talking about with the unfunded mandate as far as Medicaid is concerned. You're talking about freeing up tens of millions of dollars annually for counties.
Yes.
Which is an outrageous amount of money.
Yes. Yes. I also think programs like the circuit breaker in terms of what people can pay for property taxes I believe it would be 9% of their income up to on primary residences. Mm-hmm. But if somebody owns secondary, tertiary homes, or if they own rental properties, you know, maybe slide that scale up a bit. Mm-hmm. But I think that, you know, it's not that you want to cut into somebody's profitability, but housing is essential for a comfortable, you know, life. People need it. And often counties are paying for lower income people's housing. Often Section 8 is paying for lower income people's housing. And making sure that there's abundant housing supply within those price ranges, I think, is huge.
So to that end, a little bit your thoughts on just the spending habits generally of Albany. There seems to be the perception that Albany spends a little too much.
Sure.
And whether that's true or not, depending on the level of service that's being provided, that's a debate into itself. But just your thoughts on sort of why people have that concern and what could possibly be done from your perspective.
I'm thinking most New Yorkers live on a budget, but most people who work in Albany, certainly our elected officials, probably don't. And I think that, you know, that's something that I could bring to Albany, the perspective of somebody who's actually had to live on a budget and make the ends meet on $30,000 a year. Mm-hmm. You know, that's it's not impossible to do. It's not impossible to make less go further. And most New Yorkers are doing it on a daily basis. You know, there's certain things that I would love to bring to the conversation, like state banking, a public bank at the state level. This is something that very, very few people are talking about. But if we took a New York State bank and actually made our tax dollars work for us, mm-hmm. I think that that's something we could do instead of giving that money to Goldman Sachs and Wall Street. Well, you laugh, but the reason North Dakota created a state bank was to protect farmers from Wall Street. Mm-hmm. And if all of our income tax dollars went into one state bank, if if Tompkins County and Yates County's property taxes were being held in a state bank, if counties or municipalities needed money, like there'd be billions and billions of dollars there to leverage for whatever development or project needed doing.
And I guess to that end, is it a matter of maybe just finding some of the efficiencies that are out there, finding some of the new innovative ways to approach some of these problems, and just going at them that direction instead of trying to just work within the structures that exist already?
The structures that exist today are owned by corporations. I mean, simply put, most of our elected representatives take corporate money. When it comes time to make a political decision, it's based on who's given them the most in donations.
Would you vote to kill the LLC loophole?
Absolutely. We need campaign finance reform. Did you know that prior to the primary, somebody could have given me a check for $7,000, and then after it, they could have given me a check for $11,000? That's one individual donor.
Yeah.
That's an obscene amount of money, considering the max you can give somebody running for federal office is $2,700 before the primary and $2,700 after. And it just shows you it doesn't take very much for a handful of people to buy and sell politicians in New York State.
So I would be really interested to hear your take on just where then would our political system and our campaign system sit if all things were equal and every candidate in every race was running on the same budget?
I mean, it just would be, equal airtime. I think it would, we need electoral reform, and we need to ease access to the ballot also. Mm-hmm. But, giving everybody the same 9x6 mailer and they can do whatever they want with it, those kinds of things, I think would really help even the playing field. If I win this race, when I win this race, I'll have done it for less than $50,000, right? Mm-hmm. That's less than the median income in New York State. And, I'm running against $250,000 right now. So definitely outgunned in that respect. But everybody I've spoken to, short of a handful, seem compelled that a diner waitress actually wants to serve them in Albany.
Is that the biggest crisis facing New York right now? Is that disengaged portion of the population who just feel so dejected with the way things have been that they just aren't involved at all, and they could help a great deal just by getting involved a little bit?
A third of New York voters voted in the last midterm. Okay? Imagine if we could double that. I mean, at least we'd have a better sense of what the people wanted. I think because it's challenging to navigate the electoral process, initially, I think, people just don't believe that anybody running actually wants to represent their interests. I'm very concerned about the future, like the future that I'm never going to see. Mm-hmm. I mean, this region is beautiful.
And probably one of the biggest issues that we haven't talked too much about yet is obviously the opioid crisis.
Yeah.
Some people seem to think that it is possible to police your way out of the problem, but if you talk to law enforcement, it's actually surprising, or maybe not so surprising, that they say, whoa,
yeah,
no, it's not that easy. They can follow the laws, but there has to be, you were talking about better access to beds, faster turnaround time on getting to those beds. Is that one of the things that really, like New York State, and for that matter, every state really needs to get on the ball with that one?
I mean, number one, like law enforcement dealing with people who are using drugs, it's dangerous. It's dangerous for everybody. If you're trying to bust up a meth lab anywhere, I mean, it's almost terrifying to think about what the results could be, especially, when somebody hasn't slept in a week and mm-hmm. everybody's out to get them. And, I think we can do a better job of helping law enforcement and helping people who are addicted to drugs. I think it's more... not so much in smoking out the fox, but maybe starving out the fox. A lot of, I volunteer and I'm a client at the Enfield Food Pantry. That's how I've been able to stay on the campaign trail, right? Mm-hmm. And many of the clients who come through the line, are using drugs. So there are ways to build relationships with people who are caught in a cycle of addiction. I think it's also worth mentioning, like, I've lost several friends to drug overdoses through the years. And, you know, it's never easy. Mm-hmm. Especially when you knew them before they were a drug user, before it got out of control. And, yeah, I think what we really need to do is kind of take a step back, be a little less judgmental about how people got to where they are. And I think it's really harmful when we make assumptions and really start to try to listen to what people who have survived the cycle of addiction or broken it have to say about it, what helped them. Because what helps one person might not be best for other people. But I think it's really, it's necessary to start building relationships again. I think community-based policing, you know, local law enforcement is incredibly important and valuable, especially, you know, as officers build relationships within the communities. Mm-hmm. But I think, you know, public safety has to be the primary goal. You know, we respect our officers because they go to work, because they might not be going home that day, you know, but it's to make sure that everybody else gets home safely.
So the last question I want to ask you is just the moving forward, your outlook, win, lose, or draw. Is it positive for New York State? And then tie that into why people should vote for you on Election Day.
I mean, you know, it's funny. Like, I just think it's so important that people get out and vote. And I'm hoping that my race will bring more people to the polls than have voted in past midterms. I mean, 2018 is an absolutely unprecedented year. Mm-hmm. So it's not like I'll take all the credit, but I'm hopeful that the turnout will be bigger than normal. I'd love to see 50% turnout. That would be absolutely amazing.
That would be impressive.
And, you know, I feel voting for me is an opportunity for change. Like, if people are comfortable with things the way they are, then vote for my opponent. But, like, most of the people I speak to, like, aren't very comfortable right now. They're feeling pinched. You know, it's getting harder and harder to get by. And the thing is, I feel your pain, because that's really something that helped antagonize me to run, is that things aren't getting better. And if we don't jump in and get involved at all levels, nothing is going to change, and we're just going to keep spiraling down this, you know, toilet maybe. It's I think I will do a pretty damn good job of representing people, because that's who I come from and that's what I'm about. This isn't about corporate profits. This is about making sure that the people who live in the 58th, you know, have enough food to eat, have a warm, dry home to go to at the end of the night, and that an honest day's work, you know, earns you enough to live. I think we really can do a better job. I think it involves bringing more diversity, more perspective to the table, and that means electing a working person. Something, you know, that would totally be unheard of, but they'd be paying attention if I win, you know. All right. It'll really speak to the establishment.
And if, you know, for the folks who have been following this show, we've had a lot of these conversations, and we're hearing the same things over and over again. And it really does seem that if there were ever a year where these outsider candidates, because you're not alone, you're not the only one.
Yeah.
If there were ever a year that type of candidate could really make an impact and really do something, it certainly does seem like we're there. All right.
Yeah, I mean, if not now, when, you know, and I think that now is the time.
All right. Well, best of luck on Election Day.
Thank you for having me.
Last week and a half, keep pushing forward, and we'll hopefully be talking to you on Election night.
Hey, that would be great. You have a good night.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for us today. We'll be back next week with another edition of Inside the FLX. Until then, don't forget to download the FingerLakes1.com app for the latest news, weather, sports, and podcasts like this one directly on your smartphone or tablet. You can also listen to Inside the FLX on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you next time.